All right, folks, welcome back to the Property Couch podcast on what is part 2 of our very special deep dive on negative gearing and capital gains tax and some of the talk that's around at the moment. And Ben, we're covering some of the questions that we got from last week, but what else do we cover?
Yes, Bryce, on this special live, we're going to go deeper into housing supply and affordability and rental supply and rental affordability. So it's a big show where we throw up a few big ideas.
Big show with big ideas, folks. Let's rip into it now.
Welcome to the Property Couch, where each week you get to listen to two of Australia's leading experts. Bryce Holloway, co-host of Location Australia on Foxtel's Lifestyle Channel, co-host of Escape from the City on the ABC, and partner of Empower Wealth Advisory. Ben Kingsley, chair of Property Investors Council Australia and the founder of Empower Wealth Advisory, named the 2018 and 2019 Property Advisory Firm of the Year. Stay tuned as they bring you the insider's guide to property, finance, and money management.
Great to have you on for this live, isn't it, Bryce? We're super excited about our second live and part 2 of this deep dive into negative gearing and also the capital gain stuff. And we're going to unpack plenty of it for you today as well.
Yeah, very much so, Ben. Last week was a real success. The audience had a real appetite for us to not only bring the content, Ben, but for us to up the stress level of bringing it out to our community in a live format. And if you can imagine the stress is high for us, what about our team who's doing a fabulous job? But really what we're doing today is fulfilling on a promise, Ben, that we laid track on last week, which was really being super clear on why we think, the history of negative gearing and some of the unintended consequences of what might happen with that. But this one really is the feedback that we received from our community last week. So we're going to address some of the questions that we received. And Ben, also, we're going to put our thinking caps on and go, well, okay, it's all one thing to say, don't get rid of it, but like you've got to come up with some more solutions, Ben.
Well, that's right. So we're going to just have a look at some of the ideas around housing supply and affordability, then also switch our mind towards rental affordability and supply as well. So now there's obviously heaps of solutions out there. There's lots of ideas. We don't have time to spend the entire day, because we could spend the entire day going through hundreds of different ideas. So we're just going to cherry pick some of the interesting ones and also showcase a couple of ones that you may not have even known are available to us. A lot of innovation and technology also happening. So certainly a lot to be thinking about when it comes to this part 2 of our series, Bryce.
Very well said, Ben. And a couple of things for anyone who's listening to this via audio. It's 90% will be fine. There are some stuff that we are going to show that's visual. So we will put a link in the show notes for people to go and check out the visual options as well, Ben. And just a quick reminder that last week, all of the slides that we had from last week is available in a PDF for anyone to check that out. So if they went to thepropertycouch.com.au/negative gearing, Ben, they'll be able to download that PDF and have a look at it at their leisure.
Terrific. All right, so let's make a start, shall we, Bryce? Let's rip into the show. First one we want to look at is recapping episode 1. I think is going to be an important part of what we wanted to do. So I just wanted to quickly summarize our conclusion of thinking about what impacts the negative gearing and capital gains tax would have. And so the number one, for those people who missed last week's show, it's the supply side. There will be rental accommodation will fall. So the supply of that accommodation will fall. And that ultimately, in conjunction with obviously population growth, will just make basically housing demand to continue to increase. So it's not going to be great overall for higher rents with that undersupply and the building challenges which we articulated in last week's show. And then we sort of go into everyday Australians will miss out at the expense of big business. So in other words, if they then says, all right, build to rent is the whole solution here, well, it's going to have very limited choice for future renters. And ultimately for them to make it work, they need really, really big incentives. We think it needs to be part of the mix, and we've got more to say about that later. And then we talk about entry level and affordability properties will be more expensive because we're pushing all that demand into those higher yielding properties as those small businesses try and get those types of properties because we're forced to, because we don't have the benefit of negative gearing, which is a moment in time. And then some rental cohorts will be significantly impacted by that. So we've got to remember, yes, there are some of the most vulnerable members of our community. We'll talk about that later too, in terms of what we think we need for them versus also, but there are other people who rent by choice. And so ultimately we want to make sure that there's product available out there as well, don't we, Bryce?
We do, yes, very much so. So there's a good summary, as you said, Ben, of last week. We certainly recommend, if you haven't listened to that, go and listen to it. It makes for very compelling listening, Ben. But one of the things we did ask for the community last week was to give them some questions. We've got a cross section here that we are going to go through. So as you sort of hit the next slide on that, Ben, here is the first question that we received. And it's from Andrew via Facebook. And it said, so if 71%, and then in brackets said approximately from memory, only buy one property, that is true, it's about 71%. And then it quickly declines when you look at 2 and 3, etc. Why do we keep coming back to this argument? Is it because it only affects a small amount of people, but the rhetoric is good for votes? Is it as simple as that? Well, in parts, it is as simple as that, and it can get more complex as well, Andrew. But largely, for most people, our observation is really clear that for most people who have an opinion about this topic, sometimes it can be uninformed, and sometimes it can be largely informed based on the headlines. And clearly what we were trying to do last week is to actually demystify and debunk some of these headlines, because you're quite right. If it is only affecting 71% of the property investors are stopping at one, we are really talking about something that is impacting the minority. And as you might remember, there was a letter that was sent to Ben last week by the Honourable Prime Minister in waiting at the time. Mr. Bill Shorten, that talked about 9 or 10. Well, that was clearly an outlier. That was clearly hyperbole. That was clearly propaganda that was largely used to try and influence the electorate. So if the headlines largely are what most people hear, Andrew, and most people don't look under the bonnet, largely could be an effective strategy.
Yeah, it is, Bryce. This is all political, right? They're trying to change the narrative because they need to have a circuit breaker around solving a problem that is housing affordability. And they think, well, at the end of the day, and we've got some other great questions coming up shortly after this about how politically sensitive this story is. Well, right now it's really politically sensitive because the Greens are doing a very, very good job of telling misinformation and also promising to the renters that they're going to save them. And so ultimately, that's negative for Labor's future vote in an upcoming election. And so they need to be seen to be doing something. So, just the idea that they're running the ruler over negative gearing or capital gains tax just shows or signals to, the voters that they're looking at all sorts of opportunities here. But that's the reality here. We're in a political cycle that is challenging for the current Labor Party to be re-elected. And so they need to be seen to be doing something, because on the ground, it's very clear that we have a rental crisis and also a broader housing supply crisis. So that's part of that particular dynamic. But there is also another part to this story, Andrew, which I just want to highlight, and hopefully we'll get a bit more time later on in today's show. But if you think about it like this, the reason why most people only own 1 or 2 is because usually after 1 or 2, if you're a nurse or a teacher or a fireman or doing some form of public service job, you're not really high paid. And so ultimately that does tap you out from the ability to go and borrow more money and acquire more of those properties. And that's been our position all along in terms of the really high net worth people who are earning very, very high incomes. They'll keep finding ways of minimizing their tax. They'll keep finding ways of still being able to buy properties. But we're talking about, out of the 2.3 million property investors, there's literally hundreds of thousands of combination of nurses and teachers and those types of truck drivers. And so they're the people who do rely on that little bit of extra help in terms of starting their rental accommodation business to provide financial security for their family. So I think that's the other juxtaposition here that really needs, that narrative needs to get out to the broader community. So it's a really important story, Bryce.
Oh, I think so too, and I think we should declare self-interest here, right? And you and I are property investors. We have a business that we help other property investors, but you and I don't have 10 plus properties. So our self-interest is largely we don't want to see these reforms go away. So that's number one. But number two, hopefully we did a really good job last week of highlighting the fact that to your point that you just raised there are a lot of people who are using this mechanism. And you and I talked about this off camera, off air, where negative gearing isn't mentioned in the Tax Act. It's actually just an outcome. You can offset losses against other income. That's what it says in the Tax Act. And the negative gearing is just a label that's become part of it. So it's not a strategy. It's a tax outcome. It's a moment in time. It's for a period of time. And the whole idea of negative gearing is to not be negative gearing forever. The idea is to move that to neutral gearing and then to move that to positive cash flow, positive gearing scenario. So I think that's important. Yes, we have self-interest, but yes, there are a ton of people outside of you and me, Ben, who are really benefiting from the taxation regime that allows them to have a swing, allows them to say, I don't want the pension to be part of my future. I want to see that as a safety net. I actually want to sort of set myself up. So that's a really good question, Andrew. So it's part political, part looking after people who are actually legitimately using it as a mechanism to do good work in the community and also look after their retirement. As we sort of swing to the next question, Ben.
Sure.
Or next set of questions. We've got, I hope I don't mess this up, but Ashish saying, at the end of the day, this is for politics. Do we know how many people in Australia are affected by negative gearing? It can be and it can't be substantial enough to affect an election outcome, individual voter number. So we'll get to that in a sec, Ben. The second question from Brett is, so the $1 million question is, how do you get politicians to lift their eyes beyond an election cycle? Now, what's interesting about these two questions as a group, Ben, is elections are, when you become a strategist in elections are all about looking in the margins. It's all about looking, okay, how do we actually get some seats? So therefore, policies that we may assume with enthusiastic amateur eyes is, it's got to be good for the country. But in reality, the strategists advising parties to say, here's your vulnerable seats, here's the demographic in those seats, and so this is what we've got to do to get those swinging votes to make sure that at the end of the day, when the party and the music stops and everyone has to find a seat, that there's enough seats in our name versus the opposition's name.
Yeah, and so we do know that through the ATO data, we can work out the count of the number of people who have investment properties in certain electorates, and some of those electorates are marginal seats. So there obviously is a delicate risk in terms of, and we saw, Labor went to the 2016 and also the 2019 elections with banning negative gearing on existing property and their policies, and that didn't get them over the line. And they'd be looking closely, their statisticians would be looking closely in terms of where those concentration of investors live. And, are those investors going to be a one sort of topic voter in terms of one item voter? And so if that is the case, then, they could potentially lose that vote. So they've got to be strategic about it in terms of what that looks like. So to that question around, it's not going to change the election. Well, 2.3 million individuals, plus obviously people will have properties in their self-managed super funds. They'll also have properties owned in company names, etc. They are all going to be influenced by potentially this idea of whether we want to be an aspirational society and basically self-determine our outcome in terms of financial security, or do we want government basically doing all the heavy lifting as part of that story? And I think that's the debate we want to be in. And to Brett's point, the problem that we've seen, like, why are we here? We're here now because obviously the governments some 2 decades ago started getting out of providing social and public housing because it's very expensive, and potentially you've got a bucket of money and you don't necessarily, back in those days, we were sensible about how much debt we went into. These days, we're not so much sensitive to that. We just become populist politicians and political parties, and we just throw money at everything. But that has been the case from, why we're in this position for the last 20 years, is because the amount of social and public housing that is available for those most vulnerable in our community is just simply not there. So that is also a byproduct of that short-term thinking, as opposed to Brett's point about lifting their eyes and thinking about how they're nation building and how they're supporting the future population that's coming into the country.
So major political reform, if you have a look in the rear vision mirror, Ben, hasn't happened too much in history. You had the Hawke-Keating era that did some major reforms. You had obviously the introduction of GST, which was a major reform, but then you've had a couple of recent governments take major reform to elections and lost. So I think to that answer, how do you get politicians to lift their eyes beyond an election cycle? It's been done very rarely in history, so probably it's probably a pretty good indicator of what's going to happen in the future. So Ben, as we move to the next question here, this one's from Tyrone. We know how much negative gearing costs the government in taxes, but do we understand how much tax is generated for government by positively geared properties? How would abolishing it affect that government income? So for those that are audio, we are going to refer to a table here, but Ben, you've got some interesting stats here that you can actually answer this question, and we'll actually highlight what is actually at stake to the government if they actually do that. What would they be missing out on? Because we hear a lot about what they're giving away, but what would they be missing out on?
Yeah, so if you haven't checked out our first episode, it's on demand. You can find it on YouTube. You can find it all over the place from our websites, etc. So I encourage you to check that out, because we did a deep dive on this in terms of not only the $6.3 billion in the 2022 financial year that the government got in additional revenues or income, but we also exposed the $45 billion in capital gains revenue that the government also received as part of that particular story. Now, what I wanted to show, because we haven't shown this table before, is we can see the net number of loss in terms of individuals who are experiencing a loss, and the net number of people who have got neutral or profit as part of their 2021 financial year and then their 2022 financial year results. And we can see here, of the people who own one investment property, there is 932,000 individuals who are positively geared. So that they are contributing taxes based on their business, basically producing a profit, and they're paying tax on that. In terms of if they've got two properties, that's 250,000. Now that's compared to, say, 177,000 whose businesses are still a little young and they aren't producing a positive income off the back of that. And then you can sort of work through that table. But what you can see also just generally across the table is, because interest rates were lower in 21, 22, we did see, obviously, that means our cost of running our business has gone down. It's significantly increased since then. So we do expect this to adjust in terms of the next couple of years as the ATO reports. But in this particular case, there's a lot of revenue that has been generated off the back of a positive story for the property market.
And that's about 130,000 extra individuals difference between those two periods, Ben. So you could see that there was more people that were neutral or cash flow positive than negative gearing in that particular example. So there is, I guess the point here is, and as interest rates gone up, that'll fluctuate, and we showed that through the graph last week. But the point here is, it's not all about taking. There is a point where it's giving back, and so early in the accumulation phase, there's a bit about taking.
Yep.
But with the future view of being able to give back to the taxation.
Well, let's have a look at those totals. So the net loss, 949,519 are in net loss. In net gain, or neutral or positively geared, this is money coming back into the government coffers, 1.318 million of those. So to Bryce's point, we had more people basically giving taxes to government, whilst also that means that they're enjoying profit or passive income being generated off their properties. And again, to Tyrone's point, sometimes that's missed. A lot of the stuff that's been quoted by the politicians is from 2 years ago, when they're basically saying that negative gearing costs $3.6 billion in out-of-pocket costs for the government. That is not true. And again, we debunked that myth in the first episode. So thank you for that question, Tyrone.
And in percentage terms there, Ben, 42%, so less than half, were taking, and 58% were giving, either neutral or giving. So 42% taking, 58% either neutral or giving. So that's just, imagine if that hit the headlines, Ben. Oh, the majority of property investors aren't taking. The majority of property investors are giving. That'd be a nice headline for us to see.
Well, and yes, and also, we were talking about who does it benefit the most, and I can give you a little bit of a sneak sort of peek in. I'm working with a couple of journalists to put some stories together that basically balances out the narrative out there. So stay tuned for some of those stories to be written about what's happening in the marketplace and who is actually truly benefiting, and how important negative gearing is to those teachers and those nurses to basically play along, because otherwise it will be for the very rich who will be able to play along. You take negative gearing away, only the very rich will be able to play, and that's just not fair. So we want basically, you don't believe in trickle-down economics. You want to have a spread of those people, hundreds of thousands of those people who are doing community good work are also getting a benefit of basically building up a passive wealth base and a passive income that's going to supplement their retirement for all the great work they do in our schools and also in our health systems. So that's also a good point.
Very well said, Ben. So let's pivot the discussion then. So that's all about, okay, we made it very clear that we think that it's not a good idea to abolish. We've obviously heard from the people and some of the questions that were stimulated from that, Ben. So let's have a forward look and go into the think tank section here and go, well, okay, if we're advocates for not abolishing negative gearing and not making any major changes to capital gains tax in isolation without a thorough investigation on the whole, what are some of the other things that we could do? So we'll go through a few of those now. We'll put it out for the narrative, and we'd certainly love people to put their thoughts and their feedback in the comments, no matter where you are, or if you're going to watch this back on replay, make sure that you send those questions in, because we'll certainly love to cover them in an upcoming episode. But Ben, the first one we want to cover is, okay, well, if supply is the issue and we know there's a handbrake and there's lots of red tape, and what does it take to get people? And we have this concept called NIMBYism, which is obviously an acronym for not in my backyard. So you've come up with this radical idea, Ben, that has got some merit to it, I think, if we really flesh it out. But it's a planning or rezoning reform around 1% up zone rule. Can you tell us a bit more?
Well, I think one of the reasons why it's very difficult to get higher density into particular locations, Bryce, is the people who have bought into those locations have bought there for a reason. They love the amenity, they love the lifestyle that they've got there. So they're always very fearful of radical change that's going on. And so they often argue to their councillors, who they're elected, members that represent them, that, there's going to be overcrowding, there's going to be too many cars on small streets, car parking issues, all of those are true. And so we've always believed that it's going to be very, very difficult for councils to make those types of reforms. And the federal government's actually even throwing, millions and millions of dollars at them to hit certain targets of, sort of building approvals and zoning approvals to sort of assist that. But not if the people who live there don't necessarily want it. So the concept is a simple one where we talk about it, the 1% up zoning rule. And so what happens with the 1% up zoning rule? It just means that instead of a street being completely rezoned where it's moved from, say, single detached housing to 3-story high developments, then effectively that whole street is going to be radically changed by lots of three-story, 4-story tall apartment blocks being built in that particular location. That is going to make it very difficult in terms of moving around, that increased density in that street, etc. So the 1% rule sort of works on this principle that there are literally millions of streets in every part of Australia. And so even though the overlay might only restrict single dwelling houses, what you should be able to do is have the 1% up zone rule. So that means that if there's nothing else on this street, I can potentially build a duplex. And then there's a 1% up rule on the duplex. So if there's a duplex, I can potentially build a triplex. So all of a sudden now, by doing that sort of planning, you spread out that sort of density. So you get a lot of density quickly, but it's spread out evenly amongst all of the constituents and people who live in that community. And so that is a better rule of thumb than trying to rezone pockets that are away from transport and service hubs, because we have a different belief around those transport and service hubs that we want to talk to. So that's what this rule accomplishes. So we call it the 1% up zone rule. And we think if you had that across the country, that's going to satisfy enough of the building and activity to go around to be able to continually keep incrementally over time increasing, rather than causing all of this frustration with the NIMBYism of the people who are saying, we just didn't want that level of development and we didn't buy here for that level of development.
Yeah, that would certainly help with the 1,200,000 properties that need to happen in a 5-year period with the government right now. And imagine if you've got 15,000 plus suburbs across the country, Ben. Think about just in one suburb how many streets there are.
Correct.
And within each street, they might be able to add 1 or 2 extra properties per street across these suburbs. all of a sudden within existing infrastructure, and also satisfying some of those NIMBYism challenges that might work. So the next one here we want to talk to, Ben, is land release scheduling. So the challenge is the problem that developers have is they stall the stage of releases to create artificial scarcity. That's a marketing 101 thing, Ben. It makes sense. And quite often when they're doing their feasibilities, they need to be able to justify the early part of the capital works that they do in a subdivision or a development, so that they can get the cream on the profit at the end to make it worthwhile. It's got to be commercially sound. So what we're kind of suggesting here is you might want to introduce some incentives that release that land quicker, which might mean incentives to the developer for more release, but not at the expense of profit. So, for example, you might, as a council, you might allow larger density on a particular block. So they're selling more lots at a lower price, at a quicker release, so it gets snapped up on more people. But ultimately, the profitability of the development over time still stacks up for them. So there's the incentive for them to want to do it, and the council has to give a bit in return to make sure that it fulfills the supply, and there could be a whole bunch of other incentives that are put in place for that as well.
That's right. So it's either carrot or stick. If you're not releasing it quick enough, we'll fine you. And if you are releasing it adequately enough, we're going to make sure that the planning regulations accommodate profitability in the risks that you're taking. But the other thing is also it's how quickly, because if you release it all in bulk, we get to shovel-ready developments quicker. So it just means rather than sort of releasing it in stages, because then I've got to go off and get my building approvals all approved, etc. If everyone's sort of working on those things, it just means that we're going to have a lot more general approval and a lot more construction happening at any one time. And that's got to be a positive thing for adding quicker supply to a market when we've already said the long-term outlook for undersupply is really significant in this country unless we do something about the supply story, which is what we're talking about.
All right, next one is the higher density zoning in these urban transport services hubs. You sort of mentioned it before, with the exception of these hubs, with the other bit with your 1% rule. But the problem is you need more supply. So what's the solution here, Ben?
Yeah, so the solution is basically capitalising on the existing infrastructure. So we mentioned it before, and I think most governments and councils and they understand this, and so we do see these, sort of hubs that get set up across our bigger cities, and so increasing those densities and allowing for significant high rises to be built where the economies work for the developer, and then so that just makes common sense, right? If you've got a transport hub there where I can get on, from say Preston, they build out this, larger sort of urbanized area, and then ultimately I can then quickly get on a train, head into town if I work in town, or I can come out and have the lifestyle amenity associated with the shops and services that are around that. So we think that's a no-brainer. We are seeing some of that happening, and we think that should be incentivized for more of that to be happening. And for those people who have bought the freestanding houses closer to those areas, at some point in time, there may be a windfall for you because your land is going to be acquired by a developer in terms of turning that into apple pie in the future. So remember, we've talked to you guys before about productive use of land. So if that sort of single dwelling is then allowed to be built into a 10-story apartment block because you've combined 2 or 3 houses side by side, all of a sudden you're going to see a significant valuation on a developer buying that land. So there's a bit of a win-win all around there for those people.
Makes sense to have densities around all that existing sort of rail infrastructure in particular, and you see some of that even in Brisbane where they release applications so they can go storage just above the train station. So very good. What's the next one, Ben? We've talked about reducing state government taxes and charges because we know the problem is 40% of costs is paying government taxes and charges, but there's a multi-staged approach that we could tackle this.
Yeah, there are. And obviously we heard Tim Reardon recently when we had him on from the Housing Industry Association of Australia talk to that particular story, right? So
how to push water uphill, yeah.
Yeah. So ultimately red tape is a big problem. So the quicker you can get to approval, and Bryce, you know what it's like when you're doing all those approvals in Queensland, in that time where that did see a lot of supply come on really, really quickly. So number one is the red tape. We just need to make sure that it's more efficient planning and approvals can happen. So I don't have to go through one step, then send it off to someone else and that they take 6 months and then it goes to some other department. Like it just needs to be centralized in terms of those approval processes. The second one, because this is all coming back to reducing the cost, because any time that I'm waiting on paying staff wages, and that's all adding to the overall, project cost in terms of what I'm trying to build. And that's why, ultimately with the government at taxes, as well as all of those fixed costs that I've got in the business before I get shovel ready or get out of the ground is really important. The second point here is the reduced infrastructure cost contribution. So unfortunately, governments, because they go on these spending programs that, in terms of helping everyone, where does the money really need to be spent? And so what they do is they come back and they say, right, infrastructure cost contributions. Now we're going to take even more taxes. And that's why in Victoria, it's 44%. It's now rumoured to be over 50% in New South Wales for those costs to be passed on. So you've got to do something about reducing those costs. And that leads into probably our most radical idea here. But here is the thing. We understand that, governments need money to run services. We know that they've got to pay wages to all public servants. So what we've also been advocating for at least the last 2 years is we've got to come back for our goods and services tax, because the goods and services tax is a good tax. It's a consumption tax. So we need to broaden the base of that GST. And ultimately, that money that's collected goes back to the states. So if the governments can get higher tax revenues through consumption, which is the fairest tax on the planet, then that means that they can then say, all right, well, do I need to have these, infrastructure costs, contribution taxes? Do I need to have these windfall taxes? Do I need to have, albeit stamp duty taxes as part of that particular story? So they were the main ones that we wanted to focus on, because if the governments can work out ways in which they can collect revenues more fairly and charge out taxes more fairly, that will also be part of that. Because Tim also said, and we'll talk about this more in a moment in our future ideas, but all this beautiful park and infrastructure is built. People from other suburbs and come and have barbecues, use the free gas, use the free services and amenity, and they don't get charged for it. So it's that got to be frustrating for the developer and also potentially for those people who have bought in those new estates.
Exactly. So the next one here is land lease community. So the problem is the increasing cost of land is the barrier to buy and overall affordability. But this one might actually sort of bend some people's minds, Ben, because if you've grown up in this country, the idea of land ownership is something that is sort of fundamental in our thinking, and is really the cornerstone of the great Australian dream. But ultimately what we're talking about here is not the desire for a fancy car or the desire for what sort of a holiday you go on. It's actually the basic need of putting roof over your head. And in some cases, people don't want to go to regional locations or other communities because they want to stay around their existing community. So you've got this chicken or the egg. I want to stay here, but I can't afford it. Well, this one here is a way that someone else can own the land. You've got other private developers who are trialing this. So you buy the house, you can put on the house whatever you want, but you're not buying the land. So instead you pay rent for the land and the amenities. So if you think about the house and the land being a significant component of the cost, imagine if you're removing the land component away and it's just the house. All of a sudden it becomes very much affordable for more people in these higher land value locations where the bigger companies can afford those land bases. You can afford to actually be in these locations. Yes, you will be actually paying a rent for the privilege of having your house there, and you own that for as long as you have the lease. But you'd have ideally these long form leases, not too dissimilar to the system you find in Canberra, Ben. Ultimately, the Crown owns the land and they offer a 99-year lease, and as they get close, they get renewed. A similar scenario where you would have a longer form lease so that you've got that security of the money that you're investing in the house, but also at some point in time that lease can be tradable so you can still move on. So solves the problem of having a roof over your head, Ben, solves the problem of not having to move enormously out of these higher land value areas where most of the people want to be amongst the community and all everything that's going on, but also allows you to minimize the cost and actually get in sooner.
So, Bryce, I obviously engage with a lot of people on social media in my capacity as the chair of Picker, and there's lots of debates that go on around the fact that, there's lots of families who want to make sure that their children can afford to actually live in a dwelling, and they're not interested, so they say, in the value of their home growing in value. So I'm like, okay, well, this is the perfect solution for those people, because if that's true, in other words, they're just more interested in basically getting people into a house or into accommodation. This is the perfect solution, because if the house is an $800,000 overall land and house cost, well, you're not paying $400,000 for the land because you're not owning it. You're just paying $400,000 for the build or the improvements or the house you pick to be built on that land. And then obviously you can still trade that, but that's it. So if you are one of those believers who you think, okay, I need a solution to get my children into property, or I'm not interested in making money out of housing, then that's a great solution for you. And so I would encourage people to do more research about that. If you are interested in making sure you're getting the money back on the interest you pay on your mortgage, it's not something that I would do, because the value is in the land, and it's the land that is going to appreciate, irrespective of whatever tax system. If you're in a rich country and there's population demand and there's high activity, land values are very expensive in all those locations around the world, because owner-occupiers buy with their hearts, not their heads, and they'll keep pushing the prices up. But if you are interested in terms of housing affordability, this is a solution for you potentially.
All right, the next one, Ben, is household size in terms of formation. So the problem is we're choosing to live in less populated dwellings. So that's the cornerstone of some of the problem across this country. We don't have a room shortage. We have a standalone, in control housing shortage, right? So by opening up some of the rooms that people have in these houses, in these McMansions, in these bigger homes that aren't being used, and giving incentives to increase the number of people per household, Ben, that'll obviously remove some demand over here for the individual need, disperse it amongst the resources that already exist, which obviously frees up those dwellings for other people to
really simple. It's really simple, right? We saw the example. I'll just quickly repeat it from episode 1. In 2016, household composition was 2.59 people per household or per dwelling. And then in 2024, that went down to 2.55. So only 0.4 basis points down, not a lot. That's 160,000 extra dwellings that we've needed to accommodate that lower household formation size. So this is a quick win for any government who can understand and make sense of this. So maybe there's an incentive that if you bring your grandparents or your parents into a home, or if you keep your children there longer in tertiary study or whatever, you get some type of windfall, because that is going to be obviously cheaper than the government cost in terms of building additional housing that they need, because obviously you're crowding out the housing market. So we've got more to say about this in terms of the rental affordability story, but that is one way in which we want to look at that particular solution.
The next one to talk about here, Ben, is accessing your super for a deposit, right? So the problem is saving a deposit is the hardest step for many. So some of you might think that already exists. No, we're actually talking about accessing your super outside of the first home super saver scheme that's quarantined within that beautiful tax environment that some people get to take advantage of. And we get to talk about that more in our upcoming summer series, Ben. Now we're actually talking about here accessing the broader capital base of the super for the deposit.
Yeah, so I've thought about this a lot, because I hear the arguments for people sort of saying, well, there goes their super and the power of compound for their money in super. And I don't disagree that that's a thing to consider. But on balance, it's your money. And ultimately, if you haven't found a way to be able to save your money, and super is a forced savings mechanism of your money, then being able to use that to get into the housing market, onto the housing ladder. So only available for first home buyers to use for their first deposit for their first home. That's it. Gets them on the property ladder. Over time, you pay that down and you might upgrade and upsize to that next home. And then I started thinking about, okay, well, as you move up the property ladder, eventually you might want to move back down the property ladder. So all this argument about the money that you would lose in terms of the size of your pension fund or your superannuation in retirement, guess what? The government's now also introduced, and we've mentioned this before, if you've stayed in your property for 10 years or more and you downsize, you can take $300,000 per person of ownership dump $600,000 into both of your super funds, if you're both still alive over the age of 50. And so all of a sudden, that so-called money that you might have lost on the way up, you don't lose at all because you've just injected that money in retirement, as values of properties continue to keep growing. So I just think that on balance, there's more benefit than what there is in terms of risk. So that's something that I would say is not bad policy.
And if you're not upgrading, if you're selling, not upgrading to a house, there might be a requirement to put it back into the super fund as well, Ben. But you're right. If one of the things we see is someone who doesn't have their own house in retirement, that is counterproductive for them having a wonderful retirement anyway. So it's kind of robbing Peter to pay Paul at times. So the next one is reducing build cost, Ben. So we've seen through the last few years all sorts of challenges through construction, but largely that's traditionally slow and costly. So there are a couple of solutions to consider here.
Yeah, we want to have a little bit of fun with this, so we'll sort of talk to this. The first one is the skilled labour. We saw that again in episode 1. Chronic problem with skilled labour coming in. We've got general immigration strong, but not skilled labour. That obviously puts pressure on the demand for that skilled labour. And so that then pushes up prices because labour's high. So you bring a lot more of that skilled labour in, and there's competition for work, which means ultimately they need to be more productive. So, what's the biggest problem we've got in construction is productivity hasn't improved. Wages have definitely gone crazy. So we're not getting any net gain, and that's obviously inflationary. So that in itself is just a no-brainer that we've got to let more skilled immigrants into the country. Now we're going to get into some more interesting sort of concept. And this is basically necessity being the mother of invention. And so with the housing supply and affordability, the cost to construct, the time it takes to construct. So we're going to see more of these types of interesting construction. So
this is the point that I said before, Ben, around most of today's episode is okay for audio, but this one specifically is where it'd be nice to circle back to the video if you get a chance.
Yeah, absolutely it would. And I'm just trying to, I'm clicking on the wrong screen there, but I got it right that time. So hopefully this will come up shortly. Let's see if I can get this to work. Here we go.
I can see it.
Yeah, so this is Elon Musk's little side, and one of his side projects, one of his many side projects, Boxable. It's basically a house that is a modular house that's made in a box, and it erects itself out. And their claim is that this is going to be a $10,000 home, right? So it's a tiny home, it's a modular home, and you can put it on the trailer and you can wheel it out and effectively erect it. You've obviously still got to do the plumbing into your sewage system. So, but still, that's pretty incredible in terms of what that would look like. In terms of radically transforming the idea of, what sort of home you might want to look. So as they build more and more of these, they will bring the price down. The prototype model is around the $50,000, but they are gunning for this whole idea of making a house worth $10,000. So that's one really nice little example. The next one we wanted to sort of highlight is 3D printing. So I'm going to look at the next example here. This time we're basically watching, for those who are listening on audio, this is a 3D printer. It's printing cement in the formation of a house, and it's basically building all of the walls for the house as it goes along and puts layer upon layer of quick drying cement and effectively builds the entire frame of the house. It's obviously structurally sound once it dries. So it's potentially a very cost-effective and certainly far more a productive way of building houses. So you can get lost in all this fun stuff if you have a look around YouTube. There's certainly some fun videos to watch there, but that just gives you some idea. I mean, this is the finished product that we're seeing there in terms of what you can potentially do with this type of design. And again, now you can have curved walls. So it just really does make that quite interesting. The next one I wanted to show to you is this one here. This one, next one was really about cost-effective materials. So recyclable materials, green concrete, additives. There's a lot of sort of stuff that's being recycled. So that will obviously reduce prices if you're buying recycled price, not actually the first purchase of that particular good before it's been recycled. And the final one here, Bryce, this is for you. This is for all of your great friends. This is the West is the best. This is an incredible Western Australian company that's revolutionising. There's several of them around, but in terms of bricklaying. But this one caught my eye because you just drive the truck up that's full of the bricks, and effectively based on the 3D CAD drawing, it'll completely lay it out in terms of laser precision, in terms of building the frames, the walls of the house, and then obviously you put the Rio in and then drop the concrete in there. But that's basically a truck turning up and building you a house. And that's pretty insane. So you can check that out, a great Western Australian company showing the way in that particular area. So that just gives you some idea of some of the innovation that we know is going to be coming into the construction industry. And of course, you've got robotics and humanoid robots that are also going to remember, they'll have AGI, they'll have vision, they'll have everything that you and I have as a human, maybe with a lot more strength as well. And they don't necessarily have to stop for smoke or lunch. So there's going to be a lot of definitely changes in the next 5 to 10 years when it comes to the cost of actually constructing a home. So I do predict that the cost of constructing a home could drop by as much as 20, 30, 40% over the next 20 or 30 years. And that is going to be meaningful for basically housing affordability as part of what we're looking at here.
Keep going up, which is good. Construction goes down. That's a way to tackle affordability. Now, a couple of the next ones, Ben, are interesting to say the least. This one, a user pay approach, which is often we pay for goods and services we don't want or need. From outside of the community, some people take advantage of those facilities that to attract buyers, but we can't pay higher upfront ongoing costs. So what's the solution here, Ben?
Well, I think, it's similar to the way in which, we all pay subscription service fees and we all pay, but really the only thing we pay to play is our utility bills, right? So we buy on consumption. Now, what is definitely going to be something that will be considered over the next 5 to 10 years is this concept of using blockchains, or what's referred to as distributed ledger, where you can potentially charge people for use of your streets, charge people for use of the parks and gardens. So if you've got a new estate next to an old estate and everyone's wandering over and basically using all the new facilities over there, which they may not be paying through their council rates, or obviously from the developer's point of view in terms of them building it. Well, if there's a pay-to-play sort of model here, that's ultimately going to be something that we would see more and more of that type of thing happening. And it just means that there's so much waste that we see in councils. There's so much waste that we see in terms of thinking that they're building these facilities. I mean, the classic case is the swimming pool and the gymnasium in these big buildings. No one ever uses them, but they pay for them as part of the construction cost because it sounds like you want to. That's the emotive piece. But if it is a pay-to-play type mentality, then we're going to see less of that waste, which should also put downward pressure on some of those infrastructure builds and amenities around those particular areas.
The most obvious use of that so far, Ben, is road tolls, right? If you're not using the roads, you don't pay for it. So it's similar, but you're saying there's a blockchain way that allows someone who's playing in the bar with the barbecue in the park that'll just go against their ledger, and at some point
it'll be like a cent for every time you drive down that road or whatever that may look like, and ultimately that's potentially how you can then pay for road infrastructure. So again, it's a true user pay system as opposed to sort of guessing it by the number, charging petrol taxes or so forth, because people are putting more taxes in their car. As we go to electric, obviously there won't be that fuel excise. So we're going to have to move to a user pay type model, and blockchain will allow that to happen through, Ethereum and those types of technologies.
I like it. So the next one, Ben, to consider is selling airspace, right? So the problem is we need more affordable property in existing areas. Now, we touched on this previously with the 1% rule, but where there's already precedent in an area, Ben, you might want to sell the airspace that's above them. So think about the old school, and this I've seen this happen a number of times. Consider an old school 3-level walk-up built in the 70s, set of apartments, and you might get the existing owners to agree that they might be able to put 1 or 2 more levels based on engineering say so, that says that we can put a penthouse or a sub penthouse above us, sell that. They obviously get access to the rights above the airspace there. But what that actually means is the existing people who own in that particular development would be the beneficiaries of selling that space. So they could go ahead and pay down their mortgage, or they could go on a holiday, or they could do whatever they want with those distributed funds. But again, in the same vein as the 1% rule we talked about before, it's bringing more people into existing neighbourhoods that allow you to already take advantage of the existing infrastructure that's in place, but also increase the density, whilst probably dealing with some of the NIMBYism, Ben, because the neighbours would already be used to seeing some of that development in the street already. So just a little bit more density on top, maybe that's easier to get through.
And some of these are lightweight modular type places, Bryce. So they're actually reasonably inexpensive in a sense for being in really prime locations. So, that's the interesting part about what you were saying before in terms of, and, you might be able to get one or two on certain larger buildings. So I think there's something interesting about that. So we've got a company here in Australia who's sort of leading that. So if you want to suss them out, I think you just need to Google sort of airspace developments. They reached out to me quite a while ago in terms of sort of some of this innovative work that they're doing. So check them out if that's of something of interest to you. So now we're going to pivot now, Bryce, because we've done, obviously, look, let's just summarize that quickly. How we summarize that is, if you do look after supply, usually we can also look after the rental supply, right? If there's lots of adequate supply coming on, usually some of that's going to be in the rental mix as well. But, I was talking to a lot of people and I communicate to a lot of people, and a lot of people on social media and those types of platforms, especially on X, they're talking about, isn't it great news that sort of less investors are in the market because ultimately the property doesn't disappear. This is their great saying in terms of that. So if you're at a dinner party or if someone's sort of having this debate with you, I just thought I'd give you something that might, spike a little bit of curiosity in their minds in terms of how they reply to this. And that is that we'll always need future rental property demand based on the fact that we are, we're built on immigration as a country. That's going to continue. So here's how I've done this sort of back of envelope calculation, Bryce. What we've got here is our population currently is increasing at one person every 54 seconds, and that's birth, deaths, arrivals, and departures, right? Now, also as part of that, in terms of the household composition, let's round that to 2.6 people. So if we get a household composition of 2.6 people, so using that logic, we need a dwelling in Australia built every 2 minutes and 34 seconds. So if that was the case, then we'd need around 226,000 new dwellings built each year, or we'll actually fall away when it comes to having an undersupplied market. Now, at the moment, we're building between about 130 and 170,000 properties per year. Now, what I've also done is, a lot of that immigrants, they might have a couple of young children. So I've rounded that number down to just basically 200,000 new dwellings that we need. Well, you do the maths, 70% are owner-occupied, 30% investor. So what does that mean? Owner-occupied new dwellings, we need about 140,000 of those a year. And then rental demand, we need about 60,000 dwellings. So that equates to a need of around one new rental property every 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Let that land every 8 minutes and 46 seconds.
It's about 6.5 since we chatted on this live, Ben.
And that doesn't take into consideration losing some of that existing stock. So the examples we've used in the past about a share house and someone buying their own home and moving in, but the share house still being needed in existence. So that's ultimately taking another property out of the stock in terms of what's happening in that particular market. We also know that relationships break down and reform and break down and reform. Divorces happen every 10.5 minutes in this country. So ultimately that ratio argument of 1 to 1, where, one investment property that's being bought by an owner occupier means that, there's actually going to be no need for future rental properties, is just kibosh. It is rubbish. And anyone who tries to argue that point just doesn't understand the dynamics of the market and the fluidity in the market in terms of how the market actually moves. And that's what we're seeing at the moment. So even though our current housing density or composition is sitting at 2.55, it's actually starting to move up. More people, because of affordability constraints, are moving into that more dense accommodation. And let's not forget, in 1910, our composition was over 6 people per household. So we've still got it pretty damn good in the greatest country in the world with a current rating of 2.55. So I just wanted to leave that little sweetener there for anyone who wants to have that debate with someone at a dinner party or on Twitter or wherever they're discussing this whole idea of basically crashing the property market so everyone can get in is a good idea. It's not a good idea and it won't work anyway.
So I guess the idea around affordability ideas for the rental supply, this will come as a surprise to this audience, Ben, because they haven't heard us say this before. But stop disincentivizing small business owners who are providing rental accommodation, because if they're providing a certain amount of stock in this country and we do it better than the government does it, why wouldn't you add incentives like the West Australian government has if you have a short-term rental and you put it back into the long-term pool, they are going to give you an incentive to do that. I guess let's see property investors as the solution rather than the problem, and let's incentivize them to help. Because to your point, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, was that what it was, Ben?
Yep, 8 minutes and 46 seconds, Bryce. That's right.
Since you said that particular statement, 8 minutes is gone. So that's another property that we need. So it's important. Let's keep us in the game.
Yeah, look, it's just a really interesting reminder. These private rental accommodation providers are investing tens of billions of dollars every year. They have invested hundreds of billions of dollars to provide over 2.6 million rental properties in this country. And here we are basically disregarding them, disincentivizing them, calling them evil, calling them greedy. And so the unintended consequences of that is those investors might be going, well, do I trust the government? Will they, can I trust them that if I make this venture into running a passive rental accommodation business, that they're not going to pull the rug from under me? So that is the number one solution to build confidence so you don't lose supply into the rental accommodation market. And that's the big message there. It's 90% of the marketplace. So it's absolutely critical that they get recognized for the contribution they're making rather than be demonized. That's currently happening by some in the media and also some political parties as well.
All right, another solution, Ben, is granny flats or tiny homes. You just saw a couple of videos that help to solve that particular problem. But if you've got, in some councils you can't do it, and in other ones it takes too long for them to say yes, and there's all complexity around if there's 2 rental agreements per property. But ultimately, if you can remove that red tape and let these smaller options on these already existing land, already part of the infrastructure, well, that's obviously going to increase the supply for renters quite quickly as well.
It's a no-brainer. We just saw some examples of what those things can do, and if the quicker you can get them into the back of a house in a modular sense, that again is going to add to supply a lot quicker.
The next one, Ben, talks to the fact that we don't have a room shortage. We have a standalone housing shortage. So I guess for people over 50, there's a couple of solutions. What are they?
Yeah, so I like this idea. I mean, one of our most challenging cohorts are 50-something, and we talked about this before, and this is a serious problem in this country for women age over 50 who have not had the opportunity to potentially build up a wealth base for themselves, and so they might find themselves in financial despair or financially challenged to obviously one day own a property. But secondly to that, in terms of where, if the government hasn't supplied social or public housing, they've got a real challenge here. And so where we wanted to focus on this particular story is, well, they also want companionships, right? We're human creatures. We're socially built to be social creatures. That's been embedded in us for hundreds of thousands of years. So ultimately the story here, or maybe millions of years more to the point, is that imagine if you did have, say, an older lady who may have lost her partner, has a larger home, does not want to downgrade because she knows the area well. Imagine if she could befriend someone down at the local bridge club or the bowls club or something like that, and they're maybe not in a financial position but still want to stay in that area. She could invite 1 or 2 of those people to go co-inhabitate in her principal place of residence home, and she would be allowed to charge a rent. I'm not up to market, but not anything more. But usually it's going to be lower because it's a rent for the room, not necessarily for the full house. And this is the critical point here. At a stroke of a pen inside Parliament, we could fix this tomorrow in the sense that it doesn't impact any future capital gains. So for those people, those cohorts of people, they can start to then, and technology could help by solving this, by creating a whole new website where people can put potential houses, they can screen people, and then they can make those introductions and then ultimately start to cohabitate, in those houses. They've got companionship, they build great friendships over that time, and they're basically all being housed, which is the number one problem for that cohort. And if we do the same thing and rinse and repeat on tertiary educated students, you wouldn't necessarily make this available for everyone. So there may be a bit of fine tuning in here. And what I've done here is the maximum you could do is say 30 months over a 5-year period, but you could have a couple of uni students in your home. And again, that's not only just the board side, but it's basically helping you pay down your mortgage a little bit quicker. So giving you a little bit of extra income, not excessive. Remember, we're not talking about gouging here, but it's another way of moving that housing formation back up towards 3. And that just means we need hundreds of thousands of less dwellings built. And so those 2 strokes of pens in changing our tax act can potentially see the whole market dynamic move in a favourable direction in terms of bringing rental demand down and then ultimately putting less pressure on higher rents across the market.
Extraordinary impact. In fact, Andrea's grandmother has done that very thing, was in a room with some friends at the back of the house, had separate access, and it created an enormous difference in her world. The next suggestion, Ben, is build to rent. It currently exists. So you've got companies that are incentivized to do that. So that kind of makes sense. So to continue to incentivize.
Yeah, keep moving. That's right.
Doing it.
We recognise that it's a must-have in the mix, but it can't be all of the mix. We can't move from private rental accommodation provided to big business as the only solution.
And then the last one here we want to talk to is the public social housing, Ben. So the problem obviously is there's a ton of vulnerable people in the community, and they need to be looked after, and they need to be a very important part of this debate. But the solution is around who is that responsibility to provide that. And we're proposing that is in the hands of the government of the day, because that is what they are there to do, to support the vulnerable and the people who are at those margins. Because ultimately the property investors, if they are providing that, they need to do a commercial transaction to be able to afford it, whereas the government has got other resources to help them be in a position to provide that accommodation.
Yeah, it's a sensitive topic, but what actually happens is these well-meaning people who see, some of these more vulnerable members in our community or people who are struggling financially, they think that the best way to fix this is to regulate the entire marketplace. And so as private rental accommodation providers, there are lots of people who rent by choice. And so ultimately by regulating for the 5% of our most vulnerable, or for those well-meaning people, you're ruining the marketplace. You're basically, creating a lack of confidence in future investment into that, and that's ultimately resulting in less rental accommodation and higher rents. So the people you're trying to help, unfortunately, you're not helping at all. And so what would have been a better solution, and what should be a solution, is more social and public housing to accommodate those, more most vulnerable people in our community, and let then the marketplace, the private marketplace, go and do its thing. Okay, and let the market determine that. I'm a big believer in the free market doing the heavy lifting that it needs to do. And if big profits are being made, usually other people will come in and then basically whittle away those profits. That's how business operates in terms of a free market environment. So I just think it's an important reminder that they've got to pick up their responsibility in that particular area, but let the private market do what it needs to do, and let aspiring Australians who are looking to achieve financial freedom and financial security being able to use rental accommodation as part of that solution for them.
All right, Ben, let's head for home. Let's do a quick recap on what we've chatted about today. So really, in terms of housing supply and affordability, we talked about planning, rezoning, so that 1% upzone rule. We talked about land release scheduling in terms of giving out more incentives to get more land out. We talked about high density zoning around those urban transport service hubs, reducing state government taxes and charges. We talked about renting, lend, lease communities. We also talked about changing the household formation size, accessing super for a deposit, and also reducing build costs, which you would have seen on some of those visuals. In terms of future concepts, we did the pay-to-play approach, and we also talked about selling some airspace. And then we just rounded out the discussion then, Ben, around rental supply and affordability. So stop touching with the investors, stop over-regulating them. How can we get more granny flats, tiny homes, the housing formation for over 50s and for university students, continue to do build to rent, have the government provide the very, very important work of public and social housing. So, mate, we've definitely covered a lot over 2 lives where we've gone, okay, here's the history of negative gearing. Here's what we think will happen and the unintended consequences. And then now we've pivoted this week to going, what's the feedback we receive from our community? We're also putting our hand up to say we don't want to see this abolished for personal reasons, but also we think there's public benefit and public good for the reasons as well. And then we've come up with just a handful of different options to consider around knowing that supply is the number one issue here. So how can we address that so that more people can live where they want to, have home ownership if they aspire to do that, Ben, but also not erode the underlying wealth base of the people who have had the houses for many, many years, and in a lot of cases, decades as well.
Mate, I think you said it beautifully. And so as we wrap up, and I just remind everybody that knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it, all right? So what we want to see is government showing leadership around that story and understanding now that they have the informed information as part of this two-part series that we've done. We can also wash out the misinformation or the narrative and story that they're trying to fake and convince us of this false news or fake news in terms of what's happening out in the marketplace. So as I sign off today here, I want to just remind everyone that knowledge is empowering, but only if you act on it. And we've got a little note there to access this negative gearing series. Head to thepropertycouch.com.au, negative gearing. Final word to you, Bryce, before we close out today.
Oh, mate, it's been fun. It's been exciting for us to do it in a live environment. Hopefully our community has benefited from that. But I do want to ask this, Ben. We've got an election that's somewhere between 5 and 7 months away.
Yes.
And this is a very, very important topic. So we'd love you to share it. If you think, not just to other property investors, which is clearly the obvious part, Ben, but it's sending it to other people who you think might be swinging on this particular issue in the upcoming election, and you think being better informed, whether they choose to support us or not, Ben, but at least have that opportunity to be more informed about looking under the bonnet and looking behind the veil to see some of the actual data below the headlines that obviously get the majority of the airtime here. So we'd love to crowdsource this to our community. We obviously got a very loyal community, but we'd love for you to share that to others as well. So if you've enjoyed this live,
mate. Well said.
If you enjoyed this live, give us a like. Let us know in the comments where you're tuning in from. We'd love to see that. If you've got any questions, we will cover that in an upcoming episode. But Ben, I normally throw to you at this point and say, until next week. You've covered that off, mate.
So I have. Sorry about that. I jumped in a bit quick there, didn't I?
Until the next time we do live, Ben, knowledge is still is empowering, but only if you act on it. So we will see you next week, folks.
See you next week, guys.